Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to RealFear Files. Today we're venturing into 9 true, terrifying road trip stories. From the long, unpredictable roads of California, highways where isolation, shadowed landscapes, and chance encounters can turn an ordinary drive into something unforgettable and deeply unsettling. These accounts are drawn from travelers who expected nothing more than a routine road trip, only to confront moments that still disturb them years later. From desolate desert stretches to fog-laden mountain passes, each story reveals another hidden corner of California where the familiar gives way to the unknown. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps the channel tremendously, and you can always change your mind later. And if you have ideas for future episodes, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Now settle in. The engine's running, the road is open, and something waits just beyond the headlights. Story 1. My buddy Jace needed a break. He wanted to get out of the city for a few days. Said he had to find some fresh air somewhere that wasn't Sacramento. I knew he and Maria had recently called it quits. It sounded like a messy situation. I didn't push him to talk about it. He tossed out a spot, Deadwood Peak. It was a desolate hiking trail, basically a speck on the map, maybe 8 hours south and totally isolated. I just shrugged and said, "Cool." We used to do random road trips all the time as teens. It was mostly an excuse to bail on class and just clear our heads. So when he suggested we just jump in the car and hit the road, it felt like old times. It felt right and, honestly, kind of vital. We left that Thursday, right after we got off work. He rolled up in his beat-up old Chevy. It was still crammed with junk, empty Red Bull cans, and an ancient phone holder that was useless now. I chucked my duffel bag in the back seat, hopped in, and we took off. We didn't even exchange a full sentence, just a quick nod. The setup was always the same. He handles the first shift driving. I take over once it's past midnight. He likes being in charge when we're still near the metro sprawl, and I actually prefer the dead quiet of driving when we're way out in the sticks. That rhythm had worked for us for years. We just slid back into it. It was like no time had passed. He didn't say much for the first few hours, and I let him be. He kept one hand on the steering wheel. The other was drumming a silent beat on his thigh. Like some tune was stuck in his brain. The sun dipped below the horizon. The city lights disappeared behind us. Soon enough, we were just tearing down the highway. Nothing around but flat agricultural fields. Just the occasional truck stop breaking up the endless view. We pulled into a super dusty gas station right around midnight. It was just outside a town called Elmvale. The whole joint looked ancient, like it hadn't seen a remodel since the early 90s. Dim, sickly yellow lights were flickering overhead. One of the pumps was completely out of order, wrapped in plastic sheeting. The guy inside, behind the counter glass, was digging into instant ramen right out of the styrofoam cup. Jace filled the tank, still silent. He handed me the keys. Then he crumpled into the passenger seat. He looked like his battery had just died. I took over the driving. About an hour later, we were cruising between Black Creek and some godforsaken collection of trailers. It was a place that might have been a settlement once. Jace finally looked up from his phone. "Hey, there's a side road that cuts through the eastern foothills. We can shave at least an hour off the trip." I glanced over at him. The highway was deserted. Not a single car anywhere. "Whatever you say, man," I told him. "Your funeral." So we changed course. The turnoff was poorly marked. Just a weathered wooden sign and a nasty crunch of gravel beneath the tires. At first, I thought it was a genius move. The road was rough and empty. There was a strange, chilling silence in being the only souls out there. Nothing but gently sloping hills. The occasional silhouette of an electrical tower. Just the low hum of the tires rolling on the asphalt. That's when I spotted it. A black pickup truck. It was just a set of headlights in my rearview mirror initially. No big deal. But 10 minutes later, those same headlights were still there. The exact same distance behind us. No attempt to pass. No change in speed. Just a consistent, unnerving tail. I didn't mention it immediately. I didn't want to sound like some paranoid nutjob. But after another mile of road with 0 turns, no service stations, and 0 other traffic, I finally spoke up. "You see that truck?" I asked Jace. He lifted his head and squinted out the back window. "It's been there since that motel," I added. "The crummy roadside joint we passed maybe 30 minutes back. The one with the broken, blinking vacancy sign and an empty parking lot." He watched the truck for a few tense seconds. Then he grabbed his phone again. "Hang a left at the next road," he said. "Let's see what this guy does." The next road was barely wide enough for one car. I made the turn. The truck followed. Okay, now this felt totally on purpose. Neither of us spoke after that. The road kept shrinking, twisting, and climbing. The yellow line in the center disappeared completely. Jace tried to pull up his GPS again, but we'd lost service somewhere in the climb. I just focused on driving. I kept checking the mirror every few seconds. Still there. Not riding our bumper. Not flashing his high beams. Just tracking us perfectly. We passed a roadside turnout at one point. I started to slow down, thinking I should just let him pass us. Jace stiffened beside me. "Don't," he snapped. "Do not stop. Just keep driving." So I did. Eventually, the actual paved road just ended. Dust and gravel started spitting up under the wheels. We hadn't seen a single house or any structure at all for over half an hour. No fencing, no parked cars, not even a busted mailbox. Just endless, dark scrubland under a terrifying, starless sky. Then we rounded a sharp curve. The headlights behind us vanished. I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. I hadn't even realized how tightly I'd been gripping my nerves. "Guess he finally gave up," I mumbled. I eased my foot off the gas pedal a bit, but then we rounded the next turn. And there it was. The black truck was parked diagonally. It completely blocked both lanes. Headlights were off, but the engine was idling. The driver's side door was wide open, but the cab was empty. There was no one inside. I didn't even have a split second to process what I was seeing before Jace lunged across the center console. He slammed the gear shift into reverse. "Back up, now!" he yelled. I threw the car backward. I was crawling slowly, trying desperately not to let the car fishtail in the loose dirt. The road was too narrow to make a clean U-turn. I felt the wheels slip down the side of the embankment. Then they caught again. That's when something hit the back of our car. Hard. The entire vehicle lurched forward violently. My foot instinctively jammed the brake pedal, but Jace was screaming, "Go! Don't stop!" I floored the gas. The wheels spun. They spat up dirt and gravel as we spun, skidded, and finally caught the ground again. I didn't dare look behind us. My entire focus was just on the road ahead. On the tiny sliver of road I could see in the narrow beam of the headlights. Every turn felt like we were about to go careening off a cliff edge. We drove like that for maybe 15 minutes. No idea how far we'd gone. No clue if the truck was still on our tail, or if we were just alone in the blackness, trapped with our own surging panic. Then, at last, we saw lights. It was a gas station. Or maybe just a rotting shell of one. Rusted gas pumps. A dark, empty window. One flickering fluorescent light above the door. I swerved into the lot without thinking. I slammed the car into park. We just sat there, breathing hard. No engine noise behind us. No terrifying headlights. Just silence. Only the sound of our engine ticking as it cooled down. We waited. Finally, Jace got out. He went and knocked on the door. It felt like an eternity had passed, but it was probably 5 minutes. An old guy in a flannel shirt opened the door. He didn't look surprised to see us. He just gave us a slow, bored blink and asked if we needed directions. He let us use his restroom. He poured us a couple of plastic cups of tap water. Then he pointed us toward a tiny side road that he said would eventually hook back up to the main highway. We mumbled our thanks. We got back in the car. And that was the end of it. We made it to Deadwood Peak just as the sun was coming up. We hiked all day Friday. We barely exchanged 2 words. We camped out that night under a terrifying, silent blanket of stars. We packed up at the crack of dawn and drove straight back home. Jace and I barely exchanged 2 words once we were back on the road. The whole encounter, the chase, the blocking truck, the horrifying smash against the back bumper, it had slammed the door on any easy conversation. We were back on the highway, a silent black ribbon stretching toward the dawn. The sun was just beginning to taint the eastern sky with a bruised purple, and the fields we passed were shrouded in a thick, unsettling mist. It felt like we had just driven out of a bad dream, but the terror was still clinging to the air inside the car like stale smoke. He kept glancing in the side mirror, even though we were flying down a 4-lane highway now with plenty of trucks and early risers. I knew he was checking for the black pickup. That damn truck had completely derailed the whole purpose of the trip. It wasn't about breathing easy anymore. It was about the sickening memory of being hunted. Are we okay? I finally asked, the question feeling weak and useless. Jace didn't look at me. Yeah, he muttered, his voice raspy. Just need to get out of this zip code. The rest of the drive was a marathon of tense silence. Every set of headlights that grew large in the mirror made my gut clench. Every dark vehicle that lingered in the adjacent lane was a fresh jolt of adrenaline. It was like the isolation of the mountains had infected us. The feeling of being completely alone and vulnerable had followed us back to civilization. We finally reached Deadwood Peak just as the sun broke free, turning the sky a brutal, unflinching white. The place was exactly as advertised, scrubby, dry, and nowhere. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. We pulled into the dirt parking lot, which was thankfully empty. The moment I cut the engine, the sudden quiet was deafening. We just sat there for a minute, the only sound the metallic cooling of the engine block. Check the damage, Jace instructed, his eyes still distant, focused on something miles away. I got out, my legs stiff. The back bumper of the dented old Chevy was a mess. There was a large, sickening dent, deep enough to have buckled the trunk lid slightly. But worse than the dent were the marks. Not just a scrape, but a series of distinct, deep gouges in the metal, almost like claw marks, or the brutal impact of something sharp and heavy being dragged across the surface. It was horrifying. It didn't look like a fender bender. It looked deliberate. It looked like malice. "It's bad," I called out, my voice tight. "Real bad. Doesn't look like a truck hit us." Jace came around, stared at the jagged marks for a long moment, then just shook his head and turned away. He didn't say what he saw, but the dread in his eyes was enough. We both knew that wasn't a casual bump from an empty truck rolling backward. Something had slammed into us. We spent all of Friday hiking. We followed a steep, twisting trail. We walked for miles without speaking, the sun beating down mercilessly on the dry earth. The physical exhaustion was a kind of relief, a way to burn off the anxious energy that was still humming through our veins. The silence between us wasn't comfortable or familiar anymore. It was thick with shared trauma. I was trying to process the chilling fact that we had been stalked and assaulted in the middle of nowhere. He was just trying to outrun his own shadow. That night, we set up camp near a small, rocky outcropping. We made a small, pathetic fire that barely kept the shadows at bay. The sky above was absolutely black and vast, scattered with a trillion tiny points of light. A beautiful spectacle that only emphasized how small and insignificant we were out here. We ate cold food and drank lukewarm water. "Did you see anyone get out of the truck?" I asked, finally breaking the long silence. Jace poked at the fire with a stick. "No, the door was open, but no one was there." He paused. "It was a setup. They were waiting for us to stop." "But why us? We're just two guys on a road trip." He looked up, his eyes reflecting the weak firelight. "I don't know, man, but whatever it wasn't a random thing. It was personal." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The grim reality of the dented bumper was all the proof we needed. We slept for a few hours, the kind of light, anxious sleep where every snap of a twig outside the tent sends a jolt through you. I kept seeing the image of the truck parked sideways across the road, blocking our escape, its driver's door open like a dark invitation. We woke up before dawn on Saturday. We packed up our meager gear quickly, the thought of lingering another minute in that desolate spot unbearable. We needed to get back to the noise, the crowds, the indifferent safety of the city. The drive back was faster, fueled by a renewed sense of urgency. We took the main highway, avoiding the ill-fated detour. We didn't stop once, save for necessary gas refills, and even then, we stayed side by side. When we finally pulled back into Sacramento late that afternoon, the relief was palpable. The city was loud, dirty, and congested, and it felt like the safest place on earth. Jace dropped me off at my apartment. We stood by the dented Chevy. "Thanks for coming with me," he said, the words heavy. "Any time," I replied, but it was a lie. I hoped there would never be a next time like this. He looked down at the horrifying gouges on his bumper one last time. "I'm selling the car," he decided, stating it like a final, necessary exorcism. "And I'm not doing this again. Not for a long time." We didn't hug. We just gave each other a brief, silent nod, a recognition of the terror we had shared. I watched him drive away, the Chevy disappearing into the endless traffic, carrying the secret of the black pickup and the silent, terrifying woods with it. The trip hadn't cleared his head. It had filled it with something dark and unsettling. And mine, too. Every night, I still hear the sickening sound of metal crunching behind me, an echo of pure, unadulterated fear trapped on a lonely, forgotten mountain road. Story 2. I had meticulously mapped out a solo run down to Redwood Gulch for a long, much-needed weekend escape. Just me, my crummy little tent, and a couple of blissfully quiet hiking trails. I'd definitely been on solo excursions before, so this wasn't some dramatic, groundbreaking event in my life. Honestly, I was majorly looking forward to being utterly unreachable for a solid few days. I bailed out of Sacramento way early. I mean, the kind of early where the sky is still pitch black, specifically to dodge the inevitable weekend traffic snarls. Initially, the drive was totally smooth sailing. The interstate was clear as a bell. My killer playlist was absolutely solid gold, and my coffee stayed miraculously hot enough to keep the sleepiness at bay. I even started thinking this might turn out to be a genuinely nice experience. Scenic, a notable lack of other drivers, a little bonus adventure to kick off the journey. At first, however, the landscape was honestly kind of a snooze fest. Just endless, scrubby brown hills and those unforgiving wire fences running along the roadside. I zoomed past a handful of private ranch roads and maybe one or two long, desolate driveways that looked like they hadn't seen a tire track in months, maybe even years. 0 people, 0 other vehicles, just the sight of relentlessly rolling hills, fields of brittle, dry grass, and those sorry fences sagging heavily in the middle, like they'd completely given up their purpose of holding anything back. Then I drove past a sign. Tassel Creek, it read, barely legible against the weathered wood. The dark paint was peeling and flaking off in large chunks, and the wooden posts supporting it looked completely termite-eaten and ready to collapse at any moment. It wasn't actually pointing toward any specific location. It was just sitting stubbornly off the roadside like some lonely marker that the world had simply forgotten about. No clear turnoff, no visible stream or creek in sight, just a haunting name floating out there in the middle of nowhere. I didn't stop, just clocked it mentally as another weird little relic in the desolate landscape of rural California and mashed the gas pedal, continuing my drive. About 20 minutes after that unsettling sight, I came across the first vehicle. It was an ancient, beat-up green hatchback, sitting half-tucked onto the gravel shoulder, with one of its rear passenger doors hanging open like a slack jaw. The car appeared thoroughly abandoned, coated in a thick layer of dust, riddled with various dents, looking like it hadn't seen any basic maintenance in maybe a decade. Initially, my foot lifted off the accelerator, and I slowed way down, half prepared to pull over and check if anyone needed help. But a creeping sense of profound wrongness stopped me cold. I couldn't spot a soul nearby. The immediate area surrounding the car was unnervingly still. No farmhouses, no trail markers, not even a fence gate to indicate access, just that wide-open door swaying slightly in the faint breeze. I tried to reason with myself that someone had probably just gone for a short walk. Maybe they'd had a breakdown and hiked back in the direction of the last main highway. It felt completely bizarre, sure, but not quite terrifying enough to justify slamming on the brakes and turning my car around. So, I kept on trucking. 15 minutes later, that bizarre feeling escalated into full-blown anxiety when I completely lost cell service. Not just a drop in bars, I mean absolutely nothing. No GPS connectivity, zero data, not even the tiny spinning location dot to reassure my frazzled nerves that I was still actually marked on the planet's map. Again, I told myself, no sweat, it was no biggie. I'd lost connection loads of times on previous camping trips. I figured the signal would snap back once I got closer to the coast, but instead, the roads began to seriously narrow. The looming trees got dramatically thicker. The surrounding brush looked somehow wilder, completely untamed and utterly unmaintained. And then the subtle signs of chaos began to appear. I started noticing the garbage. It was sparse at first, an old stained paper cup here, a crushed beer can there. Then the debris got much stranger and more unsettling. Pieces of ripped-up clothing, half of a shoe, a muddy, baldled-up blanket tossed in a drainage ditch. There was even what looked like a completely melted or burned sleeping bag crammed half behind some thick underbrush. There was definitely no organized campsite or recreation area anywhere nearby. No official signage, just this gross, continuous stream of trash and more trash. It looked exactly like someone had deliberately emptied the entire contents of a vehicle over a stretch of several miles, and then just left it there to fester. That's when I saw the familiar, ominous sight of the green hatchback again. Only this time, it was parked cleanly on the opposite side of the road, facing directly toward me. Same unmistakable dent on the rear quarter panel. Same missing hubcap on the front driver's side. Same old faded bumper sticker. I thought it was maybe a Thrasher logo, but it had bleached out to almost nothing. I instantly pulled over, slamming on my brakes, and just sat there for a second, my heart hammering, desperately trying to mentally process how that was even remotely possible. I knew for a fact I hadn't taken any turnoffs. I hadn't backtracked even a single inch. The road had been stubbornly linear, only going one way, onward and deeper. No forks, no actual intersections, not even a shoulder wide enough to execute a swift U-turn without a massive struggle. I finally forced myself out of the car, taking only a few tentative steps, not daring to stray far from my own vehicle. Sure enough, there were my own tire tracks visible in the dirt, I thought. But the green car's parking angle didn't match the direction of travel. It was positioned precisely as if it had just driven in from where I was now headed. That particular moment was when a terrible, icy dread began to violently twist in my gut, like my body had already figured out the supernatural truth before my brain could catch up with the creeping horror. I scrambled back into my car and instinctively locked all the doors. It felt stupidly overcautious, definitely paranoid, but I did it without hesitation anyway. I desperately tried to convince myself it had to be a total coincidence. Just two old, crappy cars, same generic model, same beat-up, neglected shape. That's all there was to it, I lied to myself. I started driving again. The next 20 minutes were enveloped in a dead, suffocating silence. No chirp of birds, no rustle of wind, and now not a single piece of trash. Just tight, claustrophobic curves and looming trees that felt like they were deliberately leaning in a little too close, trying to watch me. It was the kind of absolute quiet that makes your ears actually ache, because they are completely unused to that overwhelming level of nothingness. Then I came around a particularly sharp bend, and there it was, an apparition of pure terror. The hatchback, this time positioned right in the dead center of the narrow road, completely blocking my path, as if some invisible driver had slammed the brakes and bolted instantly. All four doors were now horrifyingly wide open. I could see directly through the interior, which was utterly empty. No movement, no shadows. I didn't even consider getting out this time. I sat there rigidly, my high beams aimed straight at the ghastly object, my hand hovering, buzzing with adrenaline, directly over the gear shifter. Every single nerve ending in my body was completely strung out. There was simply no logical, terrestrial way for that vehicle to be there. I had not passed a single detour or a hidden service road. There was nowhere, absolutely nowhere, for another driver to loop ahead of me and pull off this sick trick. No engine noise, no telltale brake lights. Just that same damn inescapable car appearing again and again, like the very road itself was cursed, continuously coughing the wreckage back up every time I tried to leave it behind. My hands were now shaking uncontrollably on the wheel. I kept my eyes frantically scanning the dense brush, waiting for someone, or worse, something, to finally step out and reveal itself. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive trees, the dry dirt, and a nauseating metallic stench I hadn't registered before. It was faint, sharp, and sickly, like something was severely overheating, or maybe like burnt blood. Reversing was completely out of the question. The road was far too narrow and winding, and I would have had to blindly back up at least a mile, maybe more, in this menacing silence. So, with my heart absolutely pounding against my ribs, I did the only insane thing I could. I jammed my foot on the accelerator and edged the front of my car around the hatchback's rear bumper, tires crunching loudly into the dry brush lining the embankment. One sharp branch raked fiercely across my driver's side panel, loud enough to leave a deep scratch, but I honestly couldn't care less. I just wanted desperately to break free of this harrowing loop. Once I was fully past it, I completely floored the gas pedal. I didn't glance at the speedometer. I didn't dare look into the rearview mirror. I drove like something truly hideous was right behind me, its hot, noxious breath ghosting down the back of my neck. About 15 minutes of white-knuckled terror later, I burst out onto a mercifully paved intersection and spotted the small, brightly lit gas station. Lights were blazing, and I could actually see people inside. It felt profoundly unreal, like I had instantly stepped back into the normal, rule-abiding world from a dimension that had been following its own terrifying logic. My phone immediately vibrated, flooding the screen with sweet, sweet service bars. The very first thing I did after calming my racing pulse was check my map history. Eventually, I took the plunge and started digging into the mystery. I tried searching Tassel Creek to see if there were any local legends, or at least to prove to my sanity that the place was tangible. Nothing much came up on Google Maps, except for one extremely archaic article archived from the late 90s. The headline was chilling. Local man in 20s vanishes near Paso Roads. The text stated his last confirmed location was an unmarked service road near Tassel Creek. The final, blood-freezing detail: his car, which was found completely abandoned a week later, was a familiar, battered green hatchback. Story 3. I was 28, feeling invincible when this absolute nightmare unfolded. It happened somewhere in that godforsaken stretch of asphalt linking Shadow Peak to the coast, slithering along what folks call Route 77, or the Serpent's Coil. This was the third day of a lonely, solo mission road trip I'd been bragging about for ages, but never actually executed. The plan was a loose circuit. Kick off in the Central Valley, then cut deep inland through the grittiest, dustiest corners of California's heartland. The sheer horror of those inland arteries, particularly Route 77, is the endless, terrifying nothingness. You can hammer down that highway for what feels like an eternity without seeing a blessed thing. That desolation, ironically, is what drew me in. But man, does it ever start messing with your head after a while. You quickly lose all the familiar, comforting visual markers. No golden arches, no blinking gas station beacons in the bleak distance. Just blind turns, more blind turns, and monotonous, identical hills that begin to swim and distort if you stare for too long. I vividly recall the chilling moment the shift began to take hold. It was subtle, a creeping psychological decay. The road surface itself was ironically flawless. Zero potholes, not a single construction barrier. Perfect, even. But my high-tech GPS completely lost its marbles. First, the screen stopped updating its coordinates. Then, it simply froze. A few minutes later, the map wiped clean, leaving only my glowing blue location dot hanging, utterly adrift, in the midst of a featureless, beige void. No named roads, no points of interest, just pure, awful blankness. I rationalized it, of course. Figured it was just spotty satellite reception. You'd be stunned how often that crap happens in California, even with the killer tech we have today. But deep down, something was profoundly wrong. Something felt intrinsically off. I hadn't seen another vehicle, not one, bro, in nearly an hour. The oppressive, rolling hills looked somehow too motionless, too static. It's almost impossible to articulate, but the sheer space between the objects felt fundamentally incorrect, wider than it had any right to be, as if some cosmic entity had casually stretched the very fabric of the landscape. Not long after that gut-punching realization, I crawled past the completely rusted-out filling station. No original signage, no visible pumps left. Just the skeletal remains of a dilapidated building with a sun-bleached awning, and a fence that was practically weeping onto the dead dirt. I considered pulling over, perhaps just to stretch and confront the mounting dread. But there wasn't a single thing worth stopping for. It was a monument to decay. About 10 minutes of stomach-churning anxiety later, I spotted the marker. It read, Silent Bend, 12 miles. Standard green highway sign, conventional font, reflective lettering, totally routine. Nothing visually alarming about the sign itself, but the name was an absolute phantom. I had never heard of it. It wasn't on any detailed map I'd meticulously studied. nor was it mentioned in the obscure travel forums I'd obsessively browsed for insider tips. When the GPS was still half functional, Silent Bend was nowhere to be found, and it certainly wasn't in the dusty paper atlas I carried as a paranoid backup. Still, I dismissed it. It was probably just a micro-sized ranching community with a population of 30-something people and an all-volunteer fire department. This state is riddled with those forgotten specks. I tried to shrug off the mounting terror and kept driving. The road began to wickedly narrow, almost gradually, as if cunningly trying to prevent me from noticing the sinister change. More malicious turns, steeper, punishing climbs. The kind of relentless, winding path that physically forces your speed down whether your terrified brain wants to slow down or not. When I finally hit the town limit, the merciless sun was already dangerously low, right at that hellish angle where the grotesque hills start casting razor-sharp, distorted shadows directly across the road. The first thing that smacked me was the odor. It wasn't the familiar scent of dust or wood smoke or anything organic. It was just a raw, aggressive dryness that felt fundamentally disconnected from the air, like old, decaying paper that had been hermetically sealed for decades. I couldn't see any parked cars, no movement stirring behind the window panes. The houses were all cut from the same bleak, sinister cloth. Flat-roofed stucco, ugly barred windows, a single rusted lawn chair or two sinking into the sickly yellow grass. The grid was oppressively tight, barely a few blocks deep in any direction. It didn't feel abandoned exactly. It felt actively suspended, like a nightmare paused mid-scream. I hadn't planned to stop, but the road, in a deliberate, menacing motion, curved sharply into a small circle, forcing me to halt directly in front of what must have been the spectral town center. A derelict post office, a grimy diner with blinds tightly drawn, and a creepy laundromat with protective plywood nailed crudely across the windows. My engine immediately gave a sickly cough. The battery light flickered once, an unsettling crimson pulse, and then instantly died. I gingerly tapped the gas pedal, but the engine cut out completely. I sat there for a frozen second, my eyes desperately blinking at the dead dashboard. Then, shaking, I popped the hood. No smoke, no leaks, nothing mechanically wrong or visible to my horrified eyes. I checked the fluid levels, the belts. Everything appeared grimly fine. When I slid back inside and hesitantly turned the key, the engine violently roared back to life, sounding louder than normal, like nothing had even happened. But the digital clock on the dash had been completely reset to 12 o'clock, as if an invisible, powerful surge had wiped its memory clean. I froze again, staring numbly at the midnight time. That's when the true terror set in. When I had entered the roundabout, there had definitely been only one road leading in and one leading out. Now there were two. One was unquestionably the road I had just traveled. I recognized the familiar bend and the curve of the asphalt. The other road looked perfectly identical, but had a crude, hand-painted wooden sign violently nailed to a post beside it. The sign was written in a jarring, blocky font, and it simply read, "Throughways." No town I'd ever been to in this whole damn country uses a sign like that. Despite the escalating dread, I had absolutely no desire to stick around in Silent Bend to investigate the sudden, impossible presence of a second exit. I immediately took what I believed was the original entry point. 5 minutes later, I was violently thrown back into the same suffocating roundabout. I hadn't made a single turn. I hadn't looped. I hadn't even passed a fork in the road large enough to miss. I tried the recognized road again, heart pounding in my throat. Same chilling result. The third time, I cranked up the speed, foolishly thinking that maybe I had just somehow misjudged a subtle curve back near the circle. The fourth time, my sanity hanging by a thread, I committed and took the path marked Throughways. That's when the entire damn town visually corrupted. There were people now. A figure stood chillingly near the corner, holding what looked suspiciously like a black, overstuffed trash bag, just standing there, motionless. Another figure, maybe a young kid, was seated on a curb, head bowed down, arms resting heavily on their knees. No movement, no acknowledgement of my car, no sound. They didn't flinch when my headlights swept over them. They didn't react even when I frantically laid on the horn. They just stayed fixed exactly where they were, like meticulously creepy mannequins that had been carefully placed by some malevolent stage director. I don't scare easily, but a pure, viscous terror began to slide slowly into my gut right then. It was an absolute, paralyzing coldness. Worse, the gas gauge suddenly and violently dropped a full quarter tank in what felt like mere minutes. I hadn't driven far enough, not even close, for that kind of brutal consumption. I screeched to a halt in front of what I assumed was the local school. At least, I think it was a school. The lettering was half eaten away, but I could still faintly discern Intermediate Academy beneath the peeling, infected paint. Trying to cling to some shred of reality, I grabbed a scrap of paper from the center console and desperately tried to scribble the town's name down just so I could Google the demonic place later. But when I anxiously checked the note a few seconds after, the letters had violently scrambled. They weren't smeared or illegible. They were just fundamentally wrong, like they'd been instantly rewritten into nonsense when my gaze had shifted away. At that critical juncture, I just wanted out. My sanity was fraying. I tried every available road, every dark alleyway, but the town's layout was horrifically fluid and different each time. Buildings violently traded places. The ghostly diner switched from the left side to the right. The school somehow teleported itself directly behind me. I even abandoned the car and walked, trying desperately to follow a straight path on foot. But every single time I turned a corner or passed a new, oppressive building, my car was inevitably parked there, waiting for me. Same chilling position, same cracked rear window, its engine always cold. I passed a small, simple mirror nailed haphazardly to a utility pole. It was just a basic, rectangular looking glass, but it was angled strangely. It should have been reflecting the street directly behind me. Instead, it showed a terrifying reflection of my own car parked somewhere else entirely, at a non-existent T-junction. There was no T-junction. Not behind me, not anywhere in the entire looping town. The longer I was trapped, the more I felt like the entire spectral place was actively watching me. Not the silent people, but the town itself, an enormous, grinning entity. In one final, desperate Hail Mary effort, I violently veered off the paved road and drove recklessly through a wide, dirt-covered lot, betting I could cut through the blocks and somehow break whatever cursed spatial loop I was trapped in. The car shuddered and rocked hard, the suspension bottoming out with a painful thud, but then, blessedly, I hit normal, solid pavement again. And just like that, the horror town was gone. I was instantly back in the real hills, the real California hills. Golden, healthy grass, working power lines, reassuring telephone poles. I almost burst into tears. I floored it for a brutal 20 minutes, not caring one damn bit where I was heading, just trying to outrun whatever malevolent dimension I had just escaped. Then I saw another green highway marker. Silent Bend, 12 miles. I slammed the brakes so hard the car shuddered, and I screamed, a long, ragged, primal scream. There wasn't anyone in the empty landscape to hear the sheer terror. I blacked out after that. I have no idea how long I was out. When I finally came to, I was parked neatly at a bustling rest stop just outside Timberline, near Oakhaven. The sun was fully up. My car clock read 7:43 a.m. My gas tank was miraculously full again. My backpack was sitting neatly on the passenger seat. But all the scrawled receipts I'd nervously scribbled my notes on were gone. So was my phone. I found it 2 days later, jammed deep and tight under the driver's seat, its battery completely dead. I've since asked around, rangers, grizzled truckers, local old-timers in hardware stores. No one has ever heard of Silent Bend. At least, no one will admit it out loud. One guy, his face tight with terror, just told me to seriously stay the hell away from the Shadowlands Basin unless I had explicit permission. I don't drive alone anymore, especially when the sun starts dipping. And if I see a town listed on a highway sign that my maps or my gut don't recognize, I don't even slow down. I simply punch the gas. Story 4. My sister, Iris, had landed a job interview down in a town called Caton, a few agonizing hours south of us, and I immediately volunteered to tag along, just to ditch my own spiraling thoughts. Things back home had been utterly brutal lately. So we hatched a simple, almost sacred plan. We'd hit the highway before dawn, take the scenic coastal route, probably Route 12 for the bulk of it, and switch off driving after we passed the cliffs of Corland Bay. We figured we could stretch the whole miserable thing into a decent, single-day mini-adventure. Think glorious ocean views, genuinely good coffee, and killer stops. Honestly, it sounded like the perfect, restorative escape. The first, subtle crack in reality appeared before we even reached the tiny village of Heron. We were maybe an hour into the drive when the gaslight blazed on. I swore I hadn't seen the gauge plummet that fast, but whatever. I figured we'd be rolling into some little town soon enough, so I impulsively grabbed the next exit ramp. That's how we stumbled into Morrow Glen. No ominous advanced signage, no screaming billboards, just a flimsy, generic green exit sign with the name etched in tiny, easy-to-miss print. Blink, and you absolutely blew past it. The name was a phantom. I'd never heard of it. Iris hadn't either. It was one of those miserable little forgotten specks on the map that barely managed to exist. The streets were quiet, almost unnaturally sterile. Maybe 4 pitiful businesses total, and not a single soul, not a solitary person, was walking around. The place wasn't overtly run down or cliché spooky. It was just deeply, menacingly still. We eventually found a desolate gas station about 2 miles deep. One single pump and 0 other vehicles. It was almost too spotless, like some invisible hand had painstakingly scrubbed the entire structure for an unnerving photo shoot. I carefully pulled up to the pump and started fueling the tank. Iris told me she was going to quickly run inside to hit the restroom, and I told her I'd grab some road snacks. Just standard, mind-numbingly normal routine. The inside of that station was immediately and fundamentally wrong. Not in a jump scare way, but in a way that bypasses your brain and twists cold in your gut, settling deep in your ribs without any logical justification. It was enveloped in complete, suffocating silence. No ambient music, no familiar hum from the massive coolers, not even the faint, usual buzz of fluorescent light fixtures. The dude behind the counter was glued to a telephone, making no effort whatsoever to even acknowledge my presence. He was talking slowly, his voice a low, mechanical monotone, sounding precisely like he was reading the lines from a carefully rehearsed script. The shelves were fully stocked, but in this disturbingly neat, overly organized fashion that screamed of being meticulously staged. Every single product was flawlessly front-facing. There were 0 price stickers, and not a trace of dust anywhere. By the counter, a wire rack displayed a collection of flimsy pamphlets. They were all disturbingly identical. Glossy covers with deeply unsettling titles like the dry, hollow path, and east spill route. Inside, they contained no actual maps or recognizable highway numbers, just vague, utterly directionless phrases like, "Continue west through the second bluff," or "Stay to the lower bend." I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of mixed nuts and approached the counter. The clerk didn't look up. His monotonous conversation never paused. After what felt like an eternity, I cleared my throat and muttered, "Hey, just these, man." Still nothing. But without so much as breaking his robotic dialogue, he reached blindly under the counter and slid a thin paper receipt toward me. There was no scan beep, no mechanical whir of a drawer opening. It was already perfectly printed with the items listed, the correct total, and a terrifying timestamp that matched the exact, precise second I stood there. I dropped a $5 bill on the counter, grabbed my things, and fled back outside. Iris was already back in the passenger seat, her arms defensively crossed, her eyes narrowed and sharp. "Why the hell did you move the car?" she demanded. I swore to her that I hadn't touched it. She insisted it was parked differently when she came back out, further back from the pump, severely angled. I hadn't moved it, not an inch, but her conviction was absolute. I looked around wildly just to be sure. Same pump, same position. I even idiotically checked the gear shift, paranoid that the emergency brake had failed. It hadn't. I weakly suggested she must have misremembered. She didn't argue, but the raw electric tension solidified and stuck miserably in the air between us. We finally peeled out and got back on the main road. For a while, everything seemed blessedly normal. The scenery was genuinely breathtaking. Rugged golden hills on one side, sheer ocean cliffs on the other. But there were absolutely no other cars, not a single one. For almost 40 minutes, it felt like the entire stretch of coastal highway belonged only to us, trapped in a bubble of stillness. I started to feel that familiar, creeping alertness, that primal sense that something was horribly wrong. But there was still nothing specific to point at. Then we both saw the sign. "Welcome to Morrow Glen." Again. I slammed on the brakes. We both stared at it, frozen. It was the exact same sign. Same metal frame, same recognizable bend in the road, same tiny scuff on the metal post. It was physically impossible. We hadn't turned around. I hadn't even crossed the center line. We had been driving relentlessly south, following the coastline for almost an hour. With a cold, sickening lurch, we drove past the gas station again. Same desolate building, and outside the same black, anonymous SUV was parked right out front. That's when Iris finally shattered the tense silence. "Are we, stuck in something?" she whispered, her voice tight with panic. I didn't have an answer. I was desperately trying not to admit that I was thinking the exact same terrifying thing. I frantically checked my phone again. Zero service. The GPS still claimed we were pointed south, but the reassuring blue route line had completely vanished. It was just a blank, floating dot against a featureless background. I instinctively slowed down, thinking, maybe, just maybe, we should stop and ask the silent clerk for directions. But right at that moment, we sped past another sign. "Drive steady, no more stops." It was mounted like a completely regular highway sign, but the lettering was all wrong. Too sharp, too cleanly defined, too perfectly placed. Like it had been freshly made and hadn't endured a single day of weather. No dirt, no scratch marks, nothing to indicate aging, and zero exit numbers or highway labels anywhere on it. After that stark, unnerving warning, Iris didn't utter another word. She folded her hands tightly in her lap and fixed her gaze rigidly out the side window. The air inside the car began to feel fundamentally different, thinner somehow, like we were suspended inside a giant, slow-moving elevator between cosmic floors. Then we passed the damned gas station a third time. Now, the black SUV was gone. The station lights were extinguished, plunging the lot into a menacing shadow. And across the lot, parked directly next to the exact same diesel pump where we had stopped earlier, was our car. Same model, same exact plate number, same tiny, familiar dent under the driver's side mirror. It was sitting there, quiet and clean, terrifyingly real, as if it had never moved, never been driven at all. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, tires spitting gravel. The instant I stepped out of our actual car, the wind violently changed. It hit my face with a brutal, unexpected coldness that felt unnatural for a summer morning. I walked numbly toward the parked doppelganger of our vehicle, not really processing anything, just moving on autopilot. There was a small, folded piece of paper jammed tightly under the windshield wiper. I yanked it out. It was my gas receipt. Same items, same timestamp, but scrawled across the bottom, in a shaky, frantic handwriting, were the words, "It doesn't stop unless you do." I stared at that chilling message for a second longer than was safe. Then I jerked my head back toward Iris. She hadn't shifted an inch. She wasn't watching me, she was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and glassy, like she was actively forcing herself not to blink, terrified of what she might see if she did. I scrambled back into the driver's seat and punched the gas. We passed the same disgusting brown trash bag, hopelessly tangled in the same fence, the same splintered mile marker, the same unnaturally vibrant patch of wildflowers growing by a rusted guardrail. Again and again. I completely lost count after the fifth sickening pass. Finally, I spotted a narrow, barely visible turnout, just a thin strip of dirt disappearing into thick brush. It was a complete ghost on the GPS map. I took it anyway, without consulting Iris. The moment we bumped violently off the smooth pavement, it felt like the road itself finally resisted us. Gravel mercilessly pinged and shattered against the undercarriage, and my arms tensed up at the violent tug on the steering wheel. That immediate, jarring physical change, the sensory resistance, was like a welcome slap to the face. I knew we had, somehow, miraculously, crossed back into something real. After a few tense, winding minutes, we came to a large gated fire road. A tiny, deserted ranger station sat next to it, its windows crudely boarded up. A faded sign warned, "Restricted, no cars, no people." But there was a bright red emergency phone box mounted securely to a wooden post. I cautiously picked up the receiver. It rang once, then clicked with a startling finality. A low, gravelly voice, without any introduction or static, simply said, "You're out. Don't drive back." I placed the receiver back on the hook, gently this time, and got back in the car. Iris was still deathly silent. I didn't speak a word either. I just drove. Eventually, we saw a real highway sign, Linwood, Exit 15. The GPS snapped back on instantly, lighting up like a Christmas tree, showing a full signal. Our ETA updated, acting like the last 3 hours of reality-bending horror had never occurred. We stopped at a coffee shop near Elbridge. Finally, I broke the fragile silence and asked Iris what horrifying thing had happened in the gas station restroom. She looked genuinely confused, then deadly serious. "I never went in," she said softly. "I waited outside the whole time. I didn't push it. We drove to Caton just fine. She had her interview. She crushed it, actually, and she got the job. But we never, ever talked about that drive again." Story 5. My former partner and I had suffered a brutal, definitive breakup about 3 weeks prior. She had promptly moved all her stuff out. I was left with the apartment, but suddenly that space, my own sanctuary, felt fundamentally alien, like it belonged to a total stranger. Every ceramic coffee mug screamed her name. Every playlist had some awful, off-key duet we used to belt out together. I needed an immediate exit. So I threw some essentials into a duffel, grabbed my beat-up SLR camera, tossed a sleeping bag onto the rear seat, and just peeled out. No meticulously laid plans. I simply pointed the hood north and drove the hell out of St. Gabriel, deliberately avoiding the soul-crushing big freeways whenever possible. I crashed wherever I landed each night. Low-rent roadside motels where the towels reeked purely of industrial bleach and the vintage vending machine buttons were perpetually sticky. I subsisted almost entirely on dry peanut butter crackers, listened to truly awful AM radio static, and took feverish photos of anything that caught the sunlight in an unsettling way. Gnarled old fences, monolithic rusted water tanks, trees that looked chronically half-dead. I wasn't searching for enlightenment. I just craved a severe lack of familiarity. On the fourth day of this exile, somewhere deep outside a forgotten town called Hartfield, nestled east of the Sierra town of Bishop, I decided to pull off the road for a breather. It was late afternoon, maybe a couple of hours before the sun would finally surrender. I was cruising through a long, desolate ribbon of highway that ruthlessly bisected dry, colorless hills when I spotted the perfect turnout. It was just a simple dirt loop carved into the shoulder, where the obvious track marks confirmed other desperate drivers had paused before. No structures, no signs, just the oppressive, silent hills, the scraggly brush, and the asphalt road quietly curving into oblivion in both directions. I figured I'd take a quick time out, stretch my cramping legs, maybe snag a power nap before continuing toward a proper town for dinner and a real bed. I cranked the windows down just enough to admit a ghost of a breeze, killed the throbbing engine, and slumped the seat back. I must have completely zoned out, because the next thing that registered was waking up to a terrifying, profound stillness. It wasn't the sweet, peaceful quiet of rest, but more the paralyzing kind of stillness you instantly recognize when something has gone deeply wrong, yet you can't quite place the existential threat. I blinked slowly up at the car's interior roof, then sluggishly sat upright. The sun had definitely slid lower, bathing the entire landscape in that sickly, burnt orange haze that makes the world feel fundamentally unreal and staged. I glanced out at the road ahead, and that's when the first spike of panic hit. The highway looked inexplicably longer. I know how insane that sounds, but I swear to you, the sharp bend in the road, which had been barely 100 yards up before I crashed, was now scarcely visible. As if the entire distance between myself and the curve had mysteriously inflated while I slept. I rubbed my gritty eyes, checked my watch. 4:22 p.m. I distinctly remembered checking it at 4:10 p.m., just before I shut my eyes. The math was simple, the perception deeply wrong. It made zero sense, but groggy, disoriented minds habitually reach for the easiest, cheapest explanations. Maybe I miscalculated the minutes. Maybe the descending light simply distorted the depth perception. I desperately fed myself these lies as I opened the door and slowly stepped out. That's when I noticed the vehicle had moved. Not by a lot, maybe just a few unnerving feet, but enough that the old tracks in the dirt clearly betrayed the difference. The tire prints showed exactly where the car had settled originally. Now, it sat positioned slightly backward and aggressively angled, as if it had silently rolled in its sleep. Except I had absolutely left the transmission in park. The emergency brake had been firmly engaged. I instantly checked. The gear was still in park. The brake handle hadn't budged an inch. Nothing was mechanically wrong inside. I walked a slow, dizzying circle around the car, my mind frantically trying to force the pieces together. And there, directly behind the trunk, just a few feet from the rear bumper, I saw them. Disturbing marks pressed into the hard dirt. They were not conventional footprints. No recognizable sole pattern, no hint of a heel or a toe. Just smooth, sickeningly uneven ovals. 3 or 4 of them, placed in a rough, unnatural semicircle, like someone, or something, had silently walked halfway around the back of the car, paused directly at the driver's side door, and then gracefully backed away. The impressions were far too shallow for heavy boots, too round and large for bare feet, and the spacing was entirely wrong, deeply unnatural. I cautiously crouched down, trying to get a clearer, more terrifying look. That's when my phone gave a sudden, hostile buzz in my jeans pocket. I quickly snatched the phone out, intending to snap a high-resolution photo of the bizarre prints for future sanity checks. But the screen instantly glitched as soon as I accessed the camera application. It flashed once, a sharp white jolt, then violently froze. I mashed the power button, trying a hard reboot. The phone powered down, but when it surged back to life, the battery percentage had plummeted, jumping from the reassuring 80s down to a critical 4%. I hadn't touched the damn thing since checking the time moments before I drifted off. I shoved it back into my pocket, profoundly uneasy. Now, my mouth was bone dry. The kind of absolute, desert-like dryness that even a liter of water wouldn't cure. I yanked the driver's door open, needing to sit down and process the escalating, crushing dread. And that's when I saw the dashboard clock. 2:57. I stared at the 3 glowing digits, blinking rapidly. The ignition had been decisively off for over an hour. There was no conceivable reason the clock should have randomly reset, definitely not to a time hours before I had even stopped. My car wasn't brand new, but it sure as hell wasn't old enough to suffer such a fundamental, temporal glitch. I turned the key halfway, just enough to electrify the accessories without firing up the engine. The radio lit up. The AC fan clicked to life. But the clock held rigidly, stubbornly, at 2:57. I manually reset the time, not because I had any confidence in knowing the true hour anymore, but because leaving that incorrect, ghostly time displayed felt like an acknowledgement of the horror, and that was worse. I glanced into the rearview mirror one final, precautionary time. That's when I saw it. A vehicle, parked maybe a quarter-mile back, precisely where the road curved out of sight. It was pale, silver or maybe chalk white, and it was chillingly still. No headlights were on, and there was no visible movement inside. It absolutely had not been there when I got out of the car. It just sat there, slightly off-center in the lane, not pulled over on the shoulder, not angled as if it intended to stop. No one emerged. No one even cracked a door. It didn't idle. It didn't reverse. I stared, holding my breath, waiting for any sign of terrestrial life. Nothing. I quickly shifted into drive and started slowly easing forward. I kept my gaze nervously locked on the mirror. The pale car remained motionless, a frozen ghost, until it simply wasn't there anymore. No sound of tires, no visible movement, just gone. 1 second it filled the frame of the mirror. The next, the highway was utterly empty. I didn't stop to rationally figure out the vanishing act. I drove fast, not recklessly, but definitely pushing the speed limit harder than I usually would on that isolated stretch. After about 10 or 15 nerve-shredding minutes, I spotted a tiny gas station. A squat, low building with badly faded signage and a single, ancient pump. It was the kind of place that looks perpetually shuttered even when the lights are on. I pulled in, leaving the engine aggressively running, and stumbled inside. The single attendant, a middle-aged guy in a dirty ball cap, barely glanced up from behind the counter. I asked him flat out if he'd seen any cars come through recently. He didn't even pause. He just muttered that absolutely no one had passed in nearly an hour. I decided not to tell him about the vanishing car. It didn't seem like the information would matter. I checked my useless phone again, still dead. When I got back outside, I frantically scanned the road, the hills, the distant turnoff. Nothing. I was just about to wrench open the car door when I noticed something chilling on the rear driver's side window. 3 faint, distinct streaks, placed diagonally and slightly curved, as if someone had lightly dragged 3 enormous fingers across the glass from top to bottom. It wasn't simple dirt, wasn't tree sap. It looked horrifyingly oily, almost like skin oil, but thicker, more viscous. I wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket, then opened the door. I checked the locks again. They were still fully engaged. That night, I found a horrific motel just outside of town. One of those low-slung, one-story structures with perpetually buzzing fluorescent lights and the heavy, thick smell of stale air clinging to the drapes. I didn't sleep a wink. I lay rigidly on the bed, fully dressed, the cheap TV volume turned low, my eyes split between the screen and the flimsy window blinds. Every few minutes, I'd jerk up and tentatively part the slats. I never saw a single thing outside, but each time I swore that the long, empty road in front of the motel looked palpably farther away. It felt as if the stretch of pavement from the parking lot to the highway was silently gaining a few feet every hour. Like the infinite, terrifying distance between myself and something unknown was actively being calculated and measured. Before the break of dawn, I frantically packed up and left. Didn't even bother officially checking out. I just slid the key under the office door and got the hell back on the road. Story 6. My cousin Zane and I were maybe halfway through this epic, week-long road trip ripping across Northern California. We were hitting every state park, every gnarly, weird little stretch of coastline we could find, zigzagging between dense forest trails, dizzying sea cliffs, and forgotten back roads that were barely visible on any updated map. Growing up, Zane and I were basically inseparable, spending every miserable summer stuck between our family's houses in LA and up near Palo Alto. But after college, I got a job and moved way up to Oakland, and he stayed trapped down south. Over time, that geographical gap hardened into a genuine, uncomfortable distance. We tried to fight it. We had this shared Google map, absolutely littered with ominous red pins, of spots we swore looked interesting. Random waterfalls, secret hot springs, abandoned lookout points. Some were verifiable destinations, sure. Others were just vague, unsettling dots marked deep in the woods. We took turns at the wheel and just picked locations on a sheer whim. For the first few days, it felt like the way we used to be as wild kids. Purely aimless, but in the best possible way. By the 4th night, we were way out in the sticks, pretty much beyond civilization, somewhere outside this tiny settlement called Mineral. We had followed this long-forgotten logging road that branched hard off the main highway, praying it would lead us to a tucked-away clearing where we could crash. It finally did. We eventually found this flat, gravelly pull-off with enough space to park the SUV and pitch our tent. It was aggressively unofficial, obviously. No park signs, no filthy outhouses, absolutely zero cell service. But it was quiet. Overwhelming forest choked every direction. No other cars, no distant porch lights, just the two of us and the endless black trees. It was late when we finally pulled the plug, maybe pushing 9:30 p.m. We ate some disgusting canned chili, split a single lukewarm beer, and sat shivering near a fire that was struggling to catch. We were utterly dead tired. Zane crashed almost immediately. He's always been able to just switch off like that. I stayed up a little longer. I remember sitting hunched on a rough-hewn log near the fire pit, my headlamp casting a pitiful yellow circle, methodically picking through a bag of dusty trail mix and skimming a ridiculously cheesy park brochure about local fungi. And then the stillness descended. I know people always toss that word around, but I mean it was literal. There was no breeze, not a single rustling leaf, no familiar chirping of insects, nothing. It felt like some cosmic, deafening force had hit the pause button on the entire forest environment. That's when I heard the sound. Footsteps. Not the usual random twig snaps or some nocturnal animal crashing through the undergrowth. I know the clumsy sound of a raccoon or a deer. This was different. These were chillingly clear, measured steps, like the crunch of heavy boots on dry pine needles. 2, maybe 3 deliberate sounds. Then, instant, absolute silence. I froze. I instantly flicked off the headlamp, plunging myself into a pitch-black void. I sat there on the log, eyes dilated and wide, trying desperately not to breathe too loud. My frantic internal monologue told me it was maybe another idiot camper, someone who had pulled in late, but that logic was dead on arrival. We hadn't passed a single car for miles. Then I saw it. A person. Or at least the terrifying, unmistakable outline of a human shape. It was maybe 30 feet away, half obscured behind a mammoth black pine tree. It was just standing there, not moving, not advancing closer, just utterly, menacingly present. I tried to whisper Zane's name, the sound barely clearing my throat, but he didn't stir. He was dead to the world. I looked away, just for a terrifying second, to check the dim coals of the fire. When I snapped my head back toward the tree, the figure was instantly gone. I waited, maybe 10 agonizing minutes. I didn't move a muscle. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. Eventually, I convinced my own terrified mind that it had to be a trick of the dark. Maybe the extreme fatigue was making my eyes play cruel games. You have to feed yourself whatever convenient lie works when you're completely alone in the silent maw of the woods. I didn't breathe a word of it to Zane the next grim morning. We packed up lightning fast, as usual, and headed due east toward the towering volcanic peaks of Lassen. It was just another predictable day in the sacred, meticulously planned road trip. On the way to Lassen, we made a necessary pit stop for gas in this absolutely desolate, blink-and-you-miss-it settlement called Viola. The station was pure old school. One greasy pump, a faded sign that was barely legible, and creaky floorboards inside the shack. Zane went inside to snag some much-needed coffee while I topped off the tank. There was another customer at the pump across from me, a woman in her mid-50s maybe, with a deeply weathered face and a stained, ancient sweatshirt. She looked like she was rooted to the landscape, like she'd lived in that area since the dawn of time. She kept throwing quick, unsettling glances over at me while I worked the pump handle. Eventually, she slowly walked over and asked, "You boys camping out here, huh?" I hesitated for a beat, then replied, "Yeah, kinda." I told her we were just passing through, chasing scenic overlooks. She nodded slowly, chewing on her lip, like she was turning over some dark truth. Then she leaned in conspiratorially and muttered, "There's been some wicked weird stuff in the hills lately, son. You just be careful, that's all." No details, no gruesome story. Just that stark, naked warning. I gave her a polite, forced nod and smiled weakly, trying hard not to look totally freaked out, but inside, every nerve was screaming. I desperately wanted to press her for more information, but she had already turned and walked away, vanishing back into the shack. We immediately brushed it off. People in isolated small towns always have some weird, gothic folklore to share. We'd definitely heard stranger tales. Later that same afternoon, Zane pointed toward a narrow, almost invisible dirt track that violently branched off Highway 36. He had obsessively marked it on our shared map, claiming it led to some legendary ravine overlook. "Supposed to be absolutely sick," he promised. I didn't argue. We were both still desperately chasing that original, exhilarating sense of discovery we'd shared on the first couple of days. The track was pure torture. Steep climbs, massive bone-jarring rocks, and potholes that could easily swallow an entire tire. But the SUV handled the abuse like a beast. Eventually, we rolled onto this wide-open, flat stretch where the suffocating trees finally cleared out, and there was this absolutely jaw-dropping view over a deep canyon. No safety sign, no railings, just a terrifyingly sloping edge leading straight into the empty air. We parked and stood there for a long time, watching the dizzying wind move through the distant treetops far below. We took a few mandatory pictures, gnawed on some stale beef jerky. We were finally turning to head back to the car when we saw it. Another vehicle, a Jeep. It was parked maybe 50 yards further down the road, half swallowed by the thick brush at an angle that made zero navigational sense. It absolutely had not been there when we arrived. We would have spotted it immediately. Zane slowed our car to a crawl as we passed the thing. It looked old, maybe a vintage model, but intact. The windows were dusty and opaque. No one was inside. And here was the kicker. There were 0 tire tracks behind it. The road surface was soft, yielding dirt. Our tracks were clearly visible grooves. This Jeep? Nothing. We waited a tense minute, just staring at the abandoned hulk. No one emerged from the trees. No sound, no movement. Zane didn't say a single word. He just stomped the gas pedal, and we kept going, our shared terror cementing the silence. That night, we didn't go rogue. We found a proper, official campsite near Lake Almanor. There were communal fire pits, clean bathrooms, other tents nearby, even a couple of enormous RVs. It felt blessedly safe and aggressively normal. We set up, made another lazy dinner, and climbed into our respective sleeping bags. I remember lying there, trying to convince myself that I'd just let the intense isolation get to me. That's what I desperately told myself anyway. Until about 2 o'clock in the miserable morning. I woke up freezing. The fire was a dead pit of ash, the air was dense and damp, and everything felt dangerously off. I sat up quickly and reached for the zipper on my bag to seal it tighter. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Kai. Not Zane, not his voice. It was softer, gentler, sickeningly close. Then, again. Kai. My throat instantly dried up, turning to sandpaper. My hands clenched painfully around the edge of the sleeping bag, and then, with agonizing slowness, the heavy zipper on the tent door started to move. Not fast. Not violently yanked, just a soft, horrible inching sound. An inch, maybe 2. I violently snapped into motion, throwing myself forward, and shook Zane as hard as I could. He jolted awake, letting out a half shout of panic. I grabbed the industrial flashlight and savagely ripped open the tent flap, shining the searing beam into the absolute, terrifying dark. No one. Nothing. We sat there, bathed in the blinding light until the sun finally broke. We didn't exchange more than a few essential words. Zane was visibly rattled. I didn't even try to play it off this time. As soon as it was light enough to drive safely, we tore down the camp and got in the car. No coffee, no breakfast, no lingering goodbyes to the wilderness. We just left. We didn't talk much on the final, tense drive home. Every time we passed another car or saw some ambiguous shape on the shoulder, we both went unnervingly quiet. That night, I crashed hard in my apartment back in Oakland. I didn't check my phone, didn't unpack the filthy bag, just collapsed into bed. 2 days later, Zane sent me a text message. No caption. Just a single, horrifying photo attachment. It was the Jeep. The exact one we'd seen parked near the ravine overlook. Only this time, the photo was sourced from a missing persons website. Some desperate woman had posted it, begging for information, claiming it belonged to her brother. He'd vanished 5 months earlier. The last confirmed sighting of his vehicle had been near a canyon west of Viola. He never came back. I stared at the image for a long, sick moment. Then I deleted the message and the photo, blocked the search site, and slammed the laptop shut. I never responded to Zane, and I don't take road trips anymore. Story 7. My ex and I had just called it quits, officially, a week earlier. She finished packing her belongings in one chaotic day, took about half the furniture, and instantly made the entire apartment feel like one of those strange, echoey Airbnbs that has been sterilized past the point of comfort. So, when my pal Nolan texted me out of the blue about a last-minute, 3-day road trip tearing up the California coast, I didn't hesitate for a second. I texted back, "Hell yes," before I even bothered asking who else was tagging along. The plan sounded simple enough. Drive the legendary 101 from Santa Barbara up toward Monterey, crash and camp at a couple of designated spots along the way, and stop at a few bizarre, dusty roadside attractions, just for the sheer absurdity of it. Nolan had already painstakingly mapped out most of the route. His buddy Mason was bringing the tent and all the heavy-duty gear, and Mason's cousin, Becca, had a reliable silver Subaru with a cracked windshield and, crucially, enough playlists downloaded to survive any digital dead zone. I'd never met Becca before, but she showed up with the car, and a bobblehead Jesus aggressively nodding on the dashboard, and I figured, okay, this woman is probably cool. We peeled out Thursday morning, aggressively early. That kind of early where your first cup of stale gas station coffee still tastes half asleep. The first few hours were totally uneventful, just bad music, passing around a bag of stale chips, and stretching our legs at various grimy rest stops. The weather was oppressively dry, the coastal hills were baked brown, and everything outside the car felt strangely artificial, like a repeating screensaver. Our first real, deliberate stop was some half-dead miniature western ghost town, tucked behind a permanently boarded-up diner right off the main highway. The tiny buildings were all sun-bleached plywood, with names like Dead Man's Gulch and Saloon 2, painted in crooked, peeling red letters. The gallows had a hideous fake corpse swinging from it, just a stuffed pair of jeans and an old shirt crudely nailed together. The whole depressing place reeked of dry rot and old motor oil. We took ridiculously dumb pictures, climbed inside the fake jail cell, and made weak jokes about historical ghosts. It was weird, but in that fun, self-aware, kitschy way. I didn't feel great, but I felt infinitely better than I had in weeks. Then came the chilling second stop. We hadn't even planned on parking the car again that night. It was maybe 6 p.m., give or take. The sun was starting its slow, menacing dip behind a range of dusty hills as we were cruising through a long, wide stretch of absolute nowhere just before hitting a town called Sonardo. That's when Becca abruptly pulled over. No signal, no conversation, no warning. She just smoothly drifted off onto the loose gravel shoulder like she had instantly recalled some critical, forgotten duty. "What in the hell are you doing?" Mason asked from the passenger seat, sounding irritated. She didn't answer right away. She just leaned forward, pressing her face close to the windshield, staring intently like she was trying to decipher some hidden code up ahead. "There was a sign," she finally said, pointing toward the brush. "Didn't you guys even see it?" None of us had. She put the car into reverse and smoothly backed onto this narrow, treacherous dirt road that immediately plunged down into a deep gully. It wasn't marked anywhere. No visible signpost, just tall, dry grass and loose gravel winding deceptively between the hills. Becca stubbornly insisted she'd seen one. "Juno Hill Picnic Grounds," she stated, voice completely flat. Nolan instantly pulled out his phone, searched Google Maps. Nothing. He tried searching Reddit. Still nothing. I looked too. 0 results, 0 mentions, no geotags. It was as if the place simply did not, and never had, existed in the digital world. "Maybe it used to be something," Becca mused. "Like one of those forgotten family parks that got shuttered years ago." We should have absolutely said no. We should have forcefully insisted we'd just get back on the main road and drive. But nobody pushed back. I think a fatalistic part of me just didn't care where we ended up. The simple idea of sitting completely still for a while, anywhere, didn't sound so bad after the chaos of the last few weeks. The dirt road aggressively dipped left under a rusted metal archway that looked like it would collapse in the next stiff breeze. The painted letters were too weathered to decipher. It suddenly opened up into this small, flat clearing, completely surrounded by scrubby, dead grass and a few tall, spindly eucalyptus trees. In the exact center stood a wooden structure, a low, leaning canopy covering 3 picnic tables. All of them were tilting at unsettling, odd angles. The whole installation looked like it had been abruptly abandoned mid-summer and left there to bake and rot for decades. "This is fundamentally not normal," Mason muttered, only half joking this time. There was no sign of any recent visitors. No fresh tire marks, no discarded trash, not a single footprint. The air felt heavy, impossibly dry, and far too still, like the absolute vacuum inside a house that had been tightly sealed for years. I climbed out of the car and immediately registered the chilling quiet. Not a peaceful, comfortable silence, but a profound sense of wrongness. No singing birds, no buzzing insects, not even the faint natural hum of the wind rustling through the dead trees. Just this suffocating vacuum of sound, as if the entire small clearing had been surgically placed on mute. Becca stayed aggressively by the car, arms crossed tight, her eyes completely fixed on the barren hill directly behind us. "You okay?" I asked her. She didn't look at me, just gave a short, sharp nod, then pointed behind the car. "The road looks totally different now." I turned and instantly saw what she meant. The way we had come in was technically still visible, but it was visually warped. The curve was now strangely sharper, the incline impossibly steeper, and it seemed to crawl impossibly farther up the hill than it had moments before. The tall grass looked like it had grown several feet, and the narrow path itself had constricted, almost as if the road had violently aged a decade in the time it took us to park the car. "It's just the light," Nolan insisted, his voice wavering slightly. "The sun's setting. Shadows mess with perspective." We didn't argue, but all 4 of us were thinking the exact same horrifying thing, and none of us possessed the courage to articulate it out loud. We found the least leaning table and tried to force some semblance of normalcy, passing around snacks, making pathetic jokes, taking sips of warm soda. But every time I risked a glance back at that shrinking road, it felt demonstrably farther away. Then Becca suddenly wandered off. No discussion, no warning. She just stood up and walked straight into a thick patch of tall grass at the edge of the clearing. She didn't say a word. We called after her, but she didn't turn around. Nolan started to follow her, but he stopped dead when she re-emerged about 30 seconds later. She walked straight past us and got into the silver Subaru. "We need to leave, now," she announced. Her voice sounded fundamentally different. Not panicked, but colder, totally detached, as if she had just made a grim decision, and that was the final, non-negotiable end of the matter. We didn't ask questions. We just scrambled to pack up and got back in the car. Mason was visibly shaking when he climbed into the back seat next to me. I asked what was wrong, and he whispered, his voice trembling, that he had felt something standing right behind him when he was struggling to close the trunk. Not moving, just oppressively there. Becca started driving slowly. Too slowly. It was like she didn't even recognize the road anymore. We kept yelling at her to speed up, to follow the same path back, but she wouldn't respond. And then, the path ended. It just abruptly stopped. No fork, no sign, just a terrifying, impassable wall of sheer dirt and thick brush. We all got out, checked our phones, still zero signal, and decided to try walking the road back the way we came. I volunteered to go first. 10, maybe 15 minutes into the forced trek, the road aggressively curved. The same curve we'd noticed earlier. And I ended up right back in the clearing. Same leaning tables, same discarded chip bag sitting innocently on the wooden bench. I ran back, breathless, and told the others. Nolan didn't believe the word of it, so we walked it together, side by side. We kept talking the entire time, shouting to make sure neither of us had turned without realizing it. We made the curve, and we found ourselves back at the same cursed spot. The third time, we tossed 2 warm soda cans into the dirt road behind us as makeshift markers. We walked fast. No detours. We turned the bend. "The cans are ahead of us," Mason stated quietly, his voice a terrified thread. "Someone's in the trees," he added. We spun around, but he wouldn't point. He just stared in pure terror at the dense eucalyptus trees across the clearing. He said someone had been silently standing there, not moving, just watching them. He wouldn't describe them. He wouldn't even look again. Then Becca, still cold and detached, spoke. "We have to go back down," she said. She didn't mean the dirt road. She meant plunging back into the tall grass where she'd mysteriously vanished earlier. The part of the clearing no one wanted to get close to. We followed her. Single file. No one talking. The unnatural silence was heavier now, like a monstrous weight pressing down on us. 10 steps in, the tall grass started to thin abruptly. Another 20, and we slammed into a different road. Narrower, flat, mysteriously lined with pale stones. We walked, our pace quickening. Eventually, we spotted a distant gas station sign, an old, sputtering LED one, just off the main highway. We kept walking until we finally reached it. And there was the silver Subaru, somehow, inexplicably, parked right there at the pump. No explanation. No footprints surrounding it. No one dared to say anything. We just piled in and drove until we hit a motel near King City. Mason abandoned us before sunrise. Becca didn't say a single word for the rest of the next day. She dropped Nolan and me off back home and drove off without a single glance back. I volunteered to go first. 10, maybe 15 minutes into the forced trek, the road aggressively curved. The same curve we'd noticed earlier. And I ended up right back in the clearing. Same leaning tables, same discarded chip bag sitting innocently on the wooden bench. I ran back, breathless, and told the others. Nolan didn't believe the word of it, so we walked it together, side by side. We kept talking the entire time, shouting to make sure neither of us had turned without realizing it. We made the curve, and we found ourselves back at the same cursed spot. The third time, we tossed 2 warm soda cans into the dirt road behind us as makeshift markers. We walked fast. No detours. We turned the bend. "The cans are ahead of us," Mason stated quietly, his voice a terrified thread.
"Someone's in the trees," he added.
We spun around, but he wouldn't point. He just stared in pure terror at the dense eucalyptus trees across the clearing. He said someone had been silently standing there, not moving, just watching them. He wouldn't describe them. He wouldn't even look again. Then Becca, still cold and detached, spoke. "We have to go back down," she said. She didn't mean the dirt road. She meant plunging back into the tall grass where she'd mysteriously vanished earlier. The part of the clearing no one wanted to get close to. We followed her, single file, no one talking. The unnatural silence was heavier now, like a monstrous weight pressing down on us. 10 steps in, the tall grass started to thin abruptly. Another 20, and we slammed into a different road. Narrower, flat, mysteriously lined with pale stones. We walked, our pace quickening. Eventually, we spotted a distant gas station sign, an old, sputtering LED one, just off the main highway. We kept walking until we finally reached it. And there was the silver Subaru, somehow, inexplicably, parked right there at the pump. No explanation. No footprints surrounding it. No one dared to say anything. We just piled in and drove until we hit a motel near King City. Mason abandoned us before sunrise. Becca didn't say a single word for the rest of the next day. She dropped Nolan and me off back home and drove off without a single glance back. Story 8. I was stuck in a cramped apartment in Alder Creek back then, just drifting aimlessly between contract gigs. Most of my days had dissolved into a beige blur, brewing bad coffee, endlessly scrolling through digital job boards, and constantly lying to myself that I would finally update my resume. So, when this guy Gideon texted me completely out of the blue, it didn't register as being half as strange as it should have. We hadn't seen each other in maybe 7 years. We'd shared a few boring community college classes together, carpooled exactly twice, and I vaguely remembered sharing a pack of gum during one miserable finals exam. The message was bare bones. "Hey, I'm passing through for a couple of days. Want to bail on town? No agenda, just a hard reset. I'll cover all the gas." I stared at the screen for a long time. Normally, I would have instantly ghosted a random message like that. But lately, I'd felt pathologically stuck, like my entire existence had narrowed down to the space between running errands and checking email notifications. Something about the sheer, unsettling randomness of Gideon's proposal felt like it might be the jolt I needed to shake me loose. So, I said yes. He rolled up the next day in a sun-faded, ugly green behemoth of an SUV, an old Expedition with peeling Wyoming plates, and a disconcerting stack of military-grade camping gear rattling ominously in the back. I half expected there would be some other friend with him, a buffer, but it was just Gideon. His hair was cropped shorter than I remembered, and he wore the kind of clean, freshly pressed flannel shirt that made it impossible to tell if he'd just washed it or simply never worn it before. He smiled when he saw me, but the warmth didn't quite reach his eyes. They remained flat, assessing. Still, I climbed in. I assumed we'd immediately head toward the misty coast, or maybe take the scenic mountain roads for a bit, something picturesque. Instead, he drove south, turning off the main arteries whenever the impulse struck him, favoring cracked, forgotten roads that barely registered as lines on my phone's GPS. I casually asked where we were headed. He just shrugged, his attention fixed on the cracked pavement. "Wherever the road bends first." It sounded charmingly whimsical when he said it. At the time, I allowed myself to find that kind of nihilism appealing. The first day passed easily, almost lazily. We stopped at a makeshift roadside market and bought overripe peaches and a massive sack of sweet kettle corn. Gideon blasted old, unfamiliar playlists from his phone, some bizarre mix of obscure indie bands and instrumental loops that were hard to place. For a while, it honestly felt like a proper, fun road trip. He talked a little, mostly about weird, isolated places he'd been recently, none of which I could clearly visualize. That night, we pulled off onto a wide, forgotten turnout just outside a permanently shuttered campground near a lonely spot called Miller Ridge. We laid the front seats back and tried to sleep in the car. The air was crisp but not cold, and the night passed without any drama worth committing to memory. The next morning, something fundamentally shifted. We started driving before the sun had even properly risen. I hadn't fully woken up when Gideon was already steering us down a deeply unfamiliar gravel path that was less a road and more a dead track. I mumbled a question about where we were going. He simply said he just wanted to see something. No details. No tone that invited any follow-up questions. Later that morning, he pulled over without a word of warning beside a stretch of dry, cracked farmland and just walked out into the field. No explanation. He simply opened his door, stepped out, and left the engine running, ticking and hot. I watched him stand there, terrifyingly still, for maybe 10 minutes, hands hanging rigidly at his sides, staring at something I absolutely couldn't see in the vast, empty expanse. Then, just as abruptly, he came back, climbed in, and drove off like the incident had never occurred. I asked him, trying to sound casual, what that was all about. He replied, "Thought I recognized it. Guess not." That was the entire chilling exchange. I didn't dare press him further. By that night, we were deep in the middle of nowhere, somewhere east of a dusty town called Harrow Basin. Gideon pulled off onto a barely there dirt shoulder, right beside a scrubby, anonymous ridge. No streetlights, no cell signal, just a patch of utter, desolate nowhere. I asked him if he was planning to sleep there again. He didn't answer right away. He just stared out through the windshield for a few seconds too long, like he was calculating something terrible. Then he finally announced, "This is fine." He didn't move after that. He just sat there in the driver's seat. I barely slept a wink. I kept waking up at every tiny, innocuous sound, every creak of the car frame settling under the changing temperature, every rustle of dry, sharp grass being pushed against the bumper by the light wind. I kept my coat fully zipped up and one shoe loosely halfway on, just in case the urgent need arose to bolt quickly. I couldn't articulate why I felt that way yet, but the absolute dread was suffocating me. The next morning, I offered, with forced cheerfulness, to take the wheel. Gideon's response was immediate and terrifying. No. Not maybe later, not I'm good for now. Just a flat, final, non-negotiable no. I tried to pivot, suggesting it would be cool to head back west. Maybe even splurge on a cheap motel room with Wi-Fi for a night. He completely ignored the suggestion. He simply stated, "We're going east now, toward the desert." His voice held no emotion, as if he were just reading a stage direction. "Just want to see it," he said, as if the desert were some inert museum exhibit we could visit and easily leave behind. We eventually rolled into a gas station just outside of a barren place called Elkwater. It was one of those places where the entire landscape looked unsettlingly still, preserved under a layer of permanent dust. I announced I needed to get water. In reality, I just needed 5 blessed minutes away from his suffocating presence. Inside, I stood in front of the drinks fridge for much longer than necessary, reading labels on bottles I didn't care about. The small store smelled faintly of scorched rubber and something acridly burnt. I remember stepping back outside. Gideon was aggressively leaning on the front of the Expedition, one foot propped up on the bumper. The driver's door was open. He was just watching me. No smile, no wave, just watching. I told him I was far too wired and tired to sleep in the car again, and asked if we could please crash somewhere with a real bed. He didn't argue this time. He just pulled up a cheap motel on his phone, booked it instantly with one hand, while the other stayed rigidly tucked into his jacket pocket. He said it was in Maville, about 30 minutes further east. That was perfectly fine with me. I just needed walls. We didn't exchange much in the way of conversation on the way there. The place was exactly what you'd expect. Grayish stucco siding, a constantly buzzing fluorescent light fixture above the door, and an office lobby that reeked of stale, microwaved coffee. Gideon handed over his credit card and asked for one room with 2 beds. I stood awkwardly behind him, feeling an intense, cold prickle of something I couldn't quite name crawling up my spine. The clerk slid over a key card without bothering to look up. Our room was on the 2nd floor, corner unit. I sat down heavily on the bed nearest the filthy window, the one that offered a clear line of sight to the parking lot. That's when I noticed a small notepad resting on the desk. It was flipped open, suggesting someone had been writing in it earlier that day. It wasn't a fresh, untouched pad either. 2 of the corners were bent back, and heavy pen impressions had bled faintly through the page. The first few lines were utterly ordinary. A quick list of local gas prices, some random addresses, the beginnings of a grocery list. Then, about halfway down the page, centered and aggressively underlined twice, was a line that made my stomach seize up and twist. 10 is manageable, if the spacing works. I stared at it. Not for long, just long enough for every horrifying detail of the last 2 days to flood back. The way he'd stood motionless in that field. The flat, non-negotiable tone when he refused to let me drive. The way he'd looked at me outside the gas station, like a farmer assessing livestock. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask. The bathroom faucet was running loudly. I could hear him brushing his teeth, or maybe just pointlessly running the water. It was hard to tell. The door was half closed, casting a slice of painfully bright light across the carpet. I told him I was completely exhausted and climbing into bed early, and I promptly did so, facing the wall. I never turned back around. At some horrific point in the deepest part of the night, I heard him get up. The tiny fridge door clicked quietly open. Then nothing. Just absolute, profound silence. I didn't move a muscle. I kept my breathing meticulously steady, shallow, and even. A long minute passed. Then I heard the springs creak heavily on the other bed. He lay back down. Eventually, pure exhaustion dragged me under for a little while. In the morning, he was back to acting aggressively normal. Too normal. Like we hadn't just spent a night together in a state of mutual, terrified avoidance. He casually mentioned he wanted to make one quick stop before finally heading north. I seized the opportunity. I told him my fictional aunt lived nearby in a place called West Oak, and I'd just stay with her for the weekend instead. It was a blatant, desperate lie. I just needed a quick, believable escape route that wouldn't provoke any friction. He stared hard at the windshield for a drawn-out moment, then asked, "You sure about that, Rex?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and insisted, "Yeah, positive." He dropped me off outside a nameless, dusty diner, the Pines or something equally generic. He didn't offer a handshake or even a strained goodbye. He simply pulled away, the green behemoth vanishing with the same quiet, assessing expression he'd worn the whole trip. I waited inside the diner for 20 minutes, shivering. I used the weak Wi-Fi connection to frantically book a single seat on the next southbound bus heading north. I didn't text anyone about it. I didn't post anything online. I just left. Story 9. The setup was initially straightforward. Just a casual, low-key road trip carving a path from San Jose all the way down to the stark beauty of Joshua Tree. It was me, my cousin Dane, and her friend Kai. 2 nights, round trip, back by Monday. They were both the meticulous, hyper-organized type. Spotify playlists were meticulously prepped weeks in advance. Gas station snacks were already portioned neatly into Ziploc bags, and they even had laminated physical maps, a total throwback. Even though we had triple redundant GPS, I was mostly there to drive the heavy lifting. I didn't mind the role. Dane and I had been incredibly close growing up, and Kai was chill to be around. She was laid back, had genuinely good taste in music, and, most importantly, didn't talk over the songs. We were supposed to set up camp near Palm Springs the first night. Check out a few weird, abandoned roadside spots deeper in the desert. Maybe catch some legendary celestial display in Joshua Tree. And then cut back north through the vast, silent Mojave. Nothing strenuous, just a simple desert loop with solid company. And then Kai's older brother Silas asked to tag along. I didn't know Silas well at all. He was older, maybe 27 or 28. I'd only run into him a couple of times at massive family barbecues. Even then, he usually kept strictly to himself. He was one of those people who kind of hovers near active conversations but never actually contributes. He gave off a deeply strange energy, like he was constantly processing some hidden data stream that no one else was privy to. Dane had mentioned he was kind of intense, but she delivered the comment as both a light-hearted joke and a genuine warning. I immediately figured, he's just one of those quirky types. Kai insisted he would be fine, totally harmless. He didn't drive, which, looking back, probably should have been the first red flag. He just claimed he needed to get out of the city for a while. So, fine, one more passenger crammed in. From the very second he climbed into the car, it was chillingly clear that something was profoundly off. For the entire first hour, he didn't utter a single sound, just sat in the back seat directly behind me, perfectly upright, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Dane and Kai desperately tried to keep the mood light with stupid road trip games and continuous music. I tried hard not to feel acutely weirded out by the absolute silence radiating from behind my head. Then, completely out of nowhere, Silas leaned forward and delivered the punch. "What's your actual opinion about people who intentionally fake their own deaths?" No preamble, no smile, not even a hint of irony. Just that single, loaded sentence. I gave a nervous half-laugh, fully expecting a dark punchline that never arrived. I managed something eloquent like, I guess it depends on why they're doing it. Real articulate stuff. Silas didn't respond at all. He just stared at me in the rearview mirror, locking eyes with this blank, utterly unreadable gaze, and then slowly leaned back again, as if nothing had happened. I risked a glance at Dane. She was already aggressively side-eyeing him. The first night went okay, mostly because we strategically avoided talking much. We set up camp near Palm Springs, ate from a cheap cooler, and sipped on some warm, cheap beer. Kai valiantly kept the conversation flowing, and Silas mostly wandered off by himself. He walked this massive, aimless circle around the campsite for a long time, as if he were meticulously tracing the boundary of something invisible or forbidden. The next morning, he abruptly offered to cook breakfast. No one argued. We were all still half asleep and starving. He cracked a few eggs and announced he was making scrambled eggs. When I turned around a few minutes later, I saw him cracking them directly into the dry dirt. No pan, no fire. He simply let the slimy yellow and white contents run out of the shell and instantly soak into the dust, pooling momentarily in the hot ground. Kai blinked slowly at the scene. "Dude, are you seriously okay?" Silas didn't even look up at her. He said with unnatural seriousness, Cooking isn't always strictly about food. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked off into the dense brush. We laughed about it later, but it wasn't the funny kind of laugh. It was the, "Ha ha, that was super weird, right?" kind of laugh that masks genuine alarm. Dane quietly claimed the front passenger seat from that moment on, even though she insisted she didn't care about where she sat. I couldn't blame her for avoiding the rear. By the next day, the entire vibe of the trip had shifted into outright creepiness. Silas started repeating things I said, literally mirroring my exact words in the same sequence just a second or two after I'd spoken them. Like I'd say, "We should stop for gas soon," and he'd instantly parrot, "Yeah, we should stop for gas soon," using the same exact inflection and tone. Not like he was agreeing, more like a perfectly delayed recording. At first, I was certain I was losing it, just hearing echoes. But it kept happening. Dane noticed too. She didn't say anything, but I caught her looking at me more and more in the rearview mirror, like she was silently waiting for me to be the first one to crack and speak up. That afternoon, we pulled over near Amboy. It's this weird, sun-baked, half-dead stretch of forgotten Route 66. Old, rusted motel signs, a single abandoned gas pump, no actual town left, just flat heat and deafening silence. Dane and Kai wandered off to take pictures of the sign. I stayed by the car. Silas immediately got back into the rear seat, like he had an important internal process to finish. I stood outside with the door open, draining the last of a warm bottle of water, intensely debating whether I should just tell Kai we had to leave her brother somewhere with good cell service and be done with this nightmare. Then I made the catastrophic mistake of trying to talk to him one more time. I leaned against the doorframe and said, "You doing okay, man?" He turned toward me with excruciating slowness and delivered the horror that cemented my panic. "You dream about the wrong people. That's why it follows you." Then he added, flatly, "That's all he said." And I swear to God he didn't blink the entire, horrible time he spoke. I didn't answer. I just backed slowly away from the open door, sat on the edge of the hood, and waited, intensely, for the others to sprint back. I was absolutely finished. I didn't want to be in the car with him anymore, unless every single person was wide awake and actively watching. That night we stayed in a cheap, horrible motel just outside of Barstow. It was the kind of place with paper-thin walls, exactly one worn-out towel per room, and curtains that couldn't possibly close all the way. We split into 2 rooms, Dane and I in one, Kai and Silas in the other. At exactly 2 o'clock in the terrible morning, Dane violently woke me up. She whispered, "Someone just tried the door." I thought she meant someone walked by and bumped it by accident. I tried to calm her down, suggesting it was probably just another tired guest fumbling with the wrong key card. Then we heard the knock. 3 slow, distinct knocks, unnervingly spaced out. The kind of knock that isn't polite or rushed, just deliberate, like whoever was on the other side had all the endless time in the world. We instantly froze. We didn't exchange a single word, just waited, paralyzed. After what felt like an hour, we heard footsteps slowly moving away, followed by an absolute, crushing silence. Neither of us slept after that. In the morning, I went out to the vending machine to get some ice for the cooler. As I was heading back down the long, gray hallway, Silas was leaning against the wall, perfectly still, looking like he'd been posted there for hours. He looked straight at me and asked, "Why didn't you open the door, Leo?" I didn't respond. I didn't even slow my frantic pace. Back in the room, I immediately told Dane what he'd said. We both instantly agreed. We were done. We were finished with the weirdness. No more talking. No more trying to be polite. We just needed to get the hell home. But Silas wasn't finished with us. Somewhere along the relentless grind of the I-15, Silas suddenly leaned forward and urgently asked me to take a specific, random exit. He claimed he had left something important there. I was fed up. I slammed on the brakes slightly. "You haven't been on this trip before, Silas," I challenged him. "What in the world could you have possibly left behind?" He stared hard at the back of my seat and said, "I've been here. You just didn't notice." I told him no, flat out, absolutely not happening. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He just sat back down, went unnervingly quiet, and mumbled something under his breath. I couldn't catch the exact words, but the sound of it made my skin instantly crawl. It wasn't what he said. It was the chilling, disconnected way it came out. Like he wasn't talking to me or anyone in the car. Kai fell asleep shortly after that. Dane was completely buried in her phone, avoiding all eye contact. I was just laser-focused on the road, counting the miserable minutes until we could drop Silas off and get free. Then I caught the angle in the side mirror. I noticed the specific reflection. Lucas was holding his phone, angled just enough to point directly at the back of my head, like he was meticulously framing a photograph. I snapped. "Delete that." He looked at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. "Delete what?" "The photo." "There is no photo," he replied, his voice flat. I pulled over immediately. Gravel crackled loudly under the tires as I drifted onto the shoulder. I didn't say anything at first. I just put the car in park and violently spun around to face him. "You're done," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Get out." He blinked slowly, like he truly didn't understand the sequence of events. Then he calmly opened the door, stepped out with excruciating slowness, and stood there on the shoulder, hands tucked deep into his pockets, watching us drive away. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just stood there, getting smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until he finally disappeared behind a bend in the road. We dropped Kai off, then Dane. Nobody spoke much more than necessary. That was the abrupt, terrifying end of the trip. After that, I completely changed my number, blocked everyone connected to that nightmare trip on every social media platform. I ended up moving to a different city entirely about 4 months later. New job, new apartment, new everything. And I don't stop for strangers on the side of the road anymore.